Hello, welcome to the final chapter, final lecture for this semester. We left off at 9/11 last week, so we'll be moving forward from there. Obviously, a lot has happened in the last 20 years, but as we mentioned at the beginning of the semester, it's not always possible to give an accurate historical analysis of the times that we're living in. We don't have enough space to see some of the larger patterns. Certainly, while people are living through these events, you can see continuations of particular things. You can see repetition. You can see spaces for improvement, but without an extended view, it's hard to place the time frame that you're living in within historical accuracy. But we will bring it right up until basically today. And that tops off our class for this semester. And I realized that this particular semester is ending in a very strange way for most of us, where we're not meeting anymore. We were meeting in person, and due to COVID-19, which undoubtedly will be etched into the history books, we are not meeting in person. And we all are unclear exactly where things will head from here, but we will certainly find out. I hope everyone is well, and I hope that we're all on campus in the fall. So now on to today's lecture. Prior to 9/11, Bush had been involved in signing legislation to provide tax cuts that largely ended up benefiting the wealthiest Americans. So this is not a new story. We know that Reagan, most recently, had the same idea about this trickle-down economics. And the idea was that there would be investment from the top if they had more money to spend. And once again, it ended up not really making its way down the chain. And investment sort of traded hands between wealthier Americans, exacerbating the wealth gap that we now have been living in, have continued to live in. Also, the Kyoto Protocol had been established in the 1990s in order to combat global climate change, and Bush withdrew from this agreement. We can see repetition of that within the past couple years, pulling out of the Paris Climate Accord. So the United States had also done that before, where world powers had agreed upon how to conduct themselves with regard to climate change, and then the US pulls out. So a lot of the world was really disappointed with the United States at that point, and we saw this again recently, with the United States pulling out, considering the large amount of oil that is used within the United States. 9/11 ended up sort of being this turning point, and again, we can see some parts of this already. The larger narrative of this century will certainly be easier to construct later on in the century. We're not so far removed from this yet, but we did have at least one student who was not born when 9/11 happened. So it's beginning to be this historical footnote for the younger generation. And it essentially changed everything about the way that the country was operating. There was a massive outpouring of patriotism at the start by citizens of the United States, and really a large amount of support from the rest of the world right after 9/11. And what it ended up being turned into, as these sorts of situations often do, was this rallying cry for war. And September 20th, there was a televised speech to Congress by Bush where he said that freedom and fear are at war. The advance of human freedom now depends on us. And he continued to say things like our enemies hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to assemble and disagree with each other. And when asked about why the 9/11 attacks took place, Bush would oftentimes respond, because we love freedom, that's why, and they hate freedom. So it was not a particularly well thought out response to that. And certainly he was aware of more information about why these attacks happened. And the further we get away from these, the more confidential documents become viewable by the public, the 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 fuller picture we'll have. So confidential documents are kept that way for 50 years, and so when they're opened up to the public, we can get a better understanding of the historical reality. We certainly are aware of some of the historical reality because we see some of it, so we're able to record some of this, but many things could be revised or adjusted if they weren't leaked ahead of time. And this is part of the speech that he gave. So we'll play part of that.
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans, and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. The terrorists are traitors to their own faith, trying in effect to hijack Islam itself. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them. Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber. A democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms. Our freedom of religion. Our freedom of speech. Our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. They want to overthrow existing governments in many Muslim countries, such as Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. They want to drive Israel out of the Middle East. They want to drive Christians and Jews out of vast regions of Asia and Africa. These terrorists kill not merely to end lives, but to disrupt and end a way of life. With every atrocity, they hope that America grows fearful, retreating from the world and forsaking our friends. They stand against us because we stand in their way. We're not deceived by their pretenses to piety. We have seen their kind before. They are the heirs of all the murderous ideologies of the 20th century. by sacrificing human life to serve their radical visions, by abandoning every value except the will to power. They follow in the path of fascism, Nazism, and totalitarianism, and they will follow that path all the way to where it ends, in history's unmarked grave of discarded lies. Americans are asking, how will we fight and win this war? We will direct every resource at our command, every means of diplomacy, every tool of intelligence, every instrument of law enforcement, every financial influence, and every necessary weapon of war, to the disruption and to the defeat of the global terror network. This war will not be like the war against Iraq a decade ago, the decisive liberation of territory and a swift conclusion. It will not look like the air war above Kosovo 2 years ago, where no ground troops were used and not a single American was lost in combat. Our response involves far more than instant retaliation and isolated strikes. Americans should not expect one battle, but a lengthy campaign, unlike any other we have ever seen. It may include dramatic strikes, visible on TV, and covert operations, secret even in success. We will starve terrorists of funding, turn them one against another, drive them from place to place, until there is no refuge or no rest. And we will pursue nations that provide aid or safe haven to terrorism. Every nation in every region now has a decision to make. Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists.
So you can see that's a pretty decisive action that he was taking, in that he knew that this would be a long campaign, and he was fighting against an ideology, which is always difficult. And we saw that in the 1960s with trying to fight against communism. It's hard to fight against an enemy that doesn't have a uniform per se. And things became more complicated as time went on, but this was a particular time in which many nations across the world did support a retaliation strike following 9/11. So we'll continue to talk about how that changed. So Bush's intention was to launch this war on terrorism itself. You could hear in his speech, he was actually often careful not to conflate terrorism with all Muslims. But even with that happening, that doesn't mean that the people living within the United States separated it out the same way. We know that we're still dealing with a lot of racism against people of Islamic faith and people of Middle Eastern origin. And so it's sort of this vague, unpredictable timetable, and it's reminiscent of the Cold War. So we've now been involved in this war for 20 years, and there doesn't seem to be an end coming up. So you'll notice also that there was no sort of middle ground that was left available by Bush. He said, you're either with us or you're with the terrorists. So there wasn't an option to remain neutral. That is problematic for a lot of people who don't necessarily want to be involved. And following the Taliban's refusal to surrender bin Laden, Bush ordered in October of 2001, so about a month after the 9/11 attacks, airstrikes in Afghanistan. And there are still U.S. troops in Afghanistan. now, which makes this the longest war in U.S. history. And it's actually 19 years now. And this, or it will be shortly. This is not a math class. um, so this is the longest sustained war that we've been in U.S. history. The Cold War is sort of a combination of several different wars. So it depends on how you want to categorize that. But the American empire refers to the United States as being sort of power seeking in this time frame, and essentially hoping to be the sole superpower, rather than having first, second, and third world as they'd been categorized for decades, with the United States, the Soviet Union, and then the rest. The United States was sort of looking to be the sole superpower. And in a 2002 State of the Union address, Bush mentioned the existence of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, and actually even called them the axis of evil. This has come up again within the past year. The current president used language referring to the axis of evil, and this, as we know from this semester, actually refers to World War II, the Axis powers. And so trying to conflate this fight with World War II, without having the same historical context, we'll see as problematic. And the other problematic piece of this is that there was an attempt to connect these potential weapons of mass destruction to the 9/11 attacks, even though none of those nations were involved in the 9/11 attacks. So there was this intentional muddying of the waters to try to garner support for an upcoming war in these areas as well. And a lot of the sympathy that the United States had garnered from across the globe started to dissipate in the face of this attitude. And eventually there was discussion of preemptive war with regard to these weapons of mass destruction. And most of the allies of the United States really disapproved of that tactic. And most had initially approved of the response in Afghanistan following 9/11, considering 9/11 an act of war and deserving a response, a military response. But many nations across the world, most of the U.S. allies, did not approve of a preemptive war regarding. And Operation Iraqi Freedom, as it's called, went forward regardless of the massive number of protests across the world or across the nation. And Saddam Hussein was eventually captured and was tried and executed in 2006. And following the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Bush famously or infamously posed with a mission accomplished banner, even though the end to the war on terror, as he called it, and the end of specifically the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War were far, far off. And sectarian violence actually ended up spreading during the U.S. occupation, with Sunnis and Shiites continuing to be at one another's throats. And the Sunni minority had dominated under Saddam Hussein, and the Shiite majority took advantage in order to exact revenge. So the invasion of foreign troops did not help this sort of division within the country. And There were many, many bloody battles in the Iraq War, and there were about 5,000 American soldiers who were killed, and millions of Iraqis, both civilian and within the armed forces, as well as within various militia groups. In 2001, the U.S. Patriot Act was passed, and this gave the government massive authority that hadn't existed in the same way for about a century. It gave the government the authority to wiretap, to spy on citizens, to open letters, read emails, and obtain personal records from universities and libraries without a suspect's knowledge. So essentially, privacy was essentially out the window. In the immediate fallout from 9/11, 5,000 people of foreign citizenship were rounded up, and about 1,200 of them were arrested and detained without being charged, sometimes for months. There are also people who have been arrested and held without charge for years in Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. If you remember, U.S. access to Guantanamo Bay in Cuba is a result of the Spanish-American War and the U.S. siding with Cuba. And this detention center in Guantanamo Bay at one time held out about 700 detainees. There are still prisoners there today that have not been sentenced or released, and it's far less at this point. It's well under 100. I believe it's under 50. But they're still there being held without being charged, and they're not moved to the American mainland because they would have to go through the American court system at that point, and it's believed that there's not enough evidence against the people who are being held. In case you haven't seen a map of the Middle East in a long time, and we're talking about these particular areas, this should give you an idea of where Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan are, as those are the most talked about nations that we're talking about at the end of the semester here. But you've likely heard a lot about Syria recently as well. So you can see these are all sort of lined up next to each other, and it makes this particular area a hotspot for U.S. interaction. The Geneva Conventions and the International Convention Against Torture are very clear about banning the use of torture in warfare or otherwise. And in January of 2002, the Justice Department stated that the rules about torture didn't apply to Al-Qaeda operatives because they were unlawful combatants and not part of a recognized army. So they were saying that the Geneva Conventions only applied to recognized military groups and that Al-Qaeda was not one of them. So the use of torture, they believed, would then be legal. And this resulted in these sorts of abuses taking place in Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo Bay, most infamously, but there were other places. And they saw the use of electric shock and waterboarding, which is simulated drowning, dog attacks, and humiliation techniques in order to extract information. There's a 2014 Senate committee that determined that this was a systemic pattern and problem, and that it wasn't just a few bad apples, and this was a policy at the time that people were following through on. And this same committee also noted that none of the information gathered in this way was useful. It's part of the reason that torture has been banned, because the information that's oftentimes gathered from these efforts is not found to be particularly accurate or useful, and torturing people is morally reprehensible to many people. With the war in Iraq still taking place and many economic disparities weighing heavily on people, the 2004 election ended up being sort of a landslide for the sitting president. So John Kerry was a combat vet in Vietnam, and he was an anti-war protester when he returned home after what he saw. He was seen by many to be sort of aloof and out of touch with the people of the United States. This was a similar reaction that many people had had to Al Gore in the 2000 election. And as we know, Al Gore did win the popular vote in the 2000 election, but did not win the Electoral College. And Bush ended up appealing successfully to people and their fears, and he's a sitting war president, and sitting war presidents are often reelected. And he used 9/11 to sort of prove his record as a leader who could bring people through a tragedy. And Bush ended up winning by 2% of the popular vote and 34 electoral votes. So there were only 3 states that had changed in the Electoral College from 2000. New Hampshire changed to blue, and Iowa and New Mexico went red. And so after he's reelected, it's not contested like it was the first time that he's put into office. During his second inaugural address, Bush stated that there would be an end to tyranny in the world. So sort of this grand scope of ideas once again. And after his re-election, there's continuing warfare in Iraq and Afghanistan, but it's not particularly visible to people at home in the United States unless they're involved in the military. But one thing that was visible to people at home was Hurricane Katrina. So in August of 2005, New Orleans was devastated by a Category 5 hurricane that hit straight on. And this is known as Hurricane Katrina. There were several different issues that led to this being such a massive catastrophe. And there was the size of the storm, the slow evacuation, and the levees in the city broke. And FEMA was underprepared to deal with the level of the crisis. And it was mostly poor African Americans who were left to roam about in the floodwaters while dead bodies literally floated in the streets and people died in hospitals and nursing homes. There were accusations of racism in the way that this evacuation was performed, and in the way that information was handed out to people, and the way that rescue efforts were doled out. And those arguments continue to this day. Of course, this is not that long ago. This is only about 15 years ago, and New Orleans has not completely recovered from this. And in total, about 1,500 people died from this storm. And we don't typically hear those kinds of numbers with hurricanes because there's usually advance notice and preparation. And some of the reason that we don't hear those same sorts of numbers today is that we have this as an example of how not to react in the face of a potentially large hurricane. So this is why things get shut down faster these days. It does not mean that there are still not people who die in these storms. We know that there continue to be these extremely large storms that are hitting populated areas. And in For Hurricane Katrina in particular, there was about $80 billion in damage, and about 2/3 of the population of New Orleans was displaced. And they couldn't move back in directly after because their structures that they lived in had been decimated, essentially. There were and continue to be issues regarding the U.S.-Mexico border, and the Southwest had a long history of dual relationships with people and businesses on the U.S. side and the Mexican side of the border. So people would come across to perform business on a regular basis. And both Presidents Bush and Obama increased policing at the border. And by 2013, there were 20,000 U.S. Border Patrol officers. To put that into perspective, that's still less than the New York Police Department has on their rolls. And there were about 400,000 undocumented migrants who were deported annually on a regular basis as well. And in 2006, there were massive protests against a House bill, House of Representatives, making it a felony to be in the USA illegally and a crime to aid somebody in the country illegally. So people did not want it to be a felony to have crossed in into the United States and been living here. And people on the U.S. side of the border set up unofficial militias to essentially stop people from crossing. And this sort of behavior continues even today. And there were many different instances across states in the Southwest, particularly where people of Latino descent were being stopped and asked for ID. And this led to massive protests again. And once again, musical celebrities became involved. And MIA, most famously, made an extremely graphic music video called Born Free. I'm not posting it here because it's pretty graphic, but if you're interested in it, it's available online if you just look up Born Free MIA. And what she's essentially trying to point at is what would this look like? What would the reaction to this look like if the people involved looked different? So she takes a bunch of Caucasian Americans with red hair and singles them out as the people who are being pulled over and arrested and taken into the desert. So it's an attempt to turn the tables on those who were in favor of essentially shooting people down or making citizens arrests along the border. In June of 2003, there were a couple of important court cases that went to the Supreme Court of the United States. The Bakke case, this is affirmative action, was upheld in the face of a challenge over University of Michigan admissions. And this was a 5-4 vote that said that using race as a factor in admissions was still permissible. So the attempt at affirmative action, as we've gone over before, was to open up doors for historically discriminated against groups, so racial minorities specifically. And there was a challenge saying that using somebody's race to either boost them up or move them down within the ranks was inappropriate. But the case settled as it was permissible to do so because there were historically disadvantaged minority groups. And if everyone's not starting on the same footing, that there would be a time where it would be appropriate to consider that the starting grounds for people are different based on race, which is based on the history of the United States. So this is a historically entrenched decision. And in Lawrence v. Texas, this was a 6-3 decision, and they decided that it was unconstitutional to make homosexual acts illegal. There were states that had said that if specifically they would use the term sodomy, so meaning anal sex, that would be illegal, and if people were caught, then they could be taken to jail for that. And this made it unconstitutional to say that those sorts of sexual acts were illegal. And in 2015, there was a Supreme Court case that made it to all the way to the Supreme Court, obviously, if it's a Supreme Court case, that made same-sex marriage legal on a federal level. So this law is actually only about 5 years old, and like many of the acts and constitutional amendments that have passed through, this one went state by state in different levels. So there had been civil unions, there had been marriages permitted between same-sex couples in different states, and then eventually it became a federal law as well. And Anthony Kennedy ended up writing the opinion for that and noted that the Constitution is a living document and that it was to be interpreted as written, not as the 1700s would have expected. So there was no way to tell what they thought in the last third of the 1700s, and that they needed to consider what these words could mean in current times. The midterm election in 2006 brought the U.S. its first female Speaker of the House of Representatives in Nancy Pelosi. That's likely a name that you're still familiar with if you are interested in politics. And by the end of Bush's second term, Bush had 22% approval rate. So this is pretty low, as you can tell. And it was clear that much of the nation was really starting to look for something different. They did not like the path that they had been led down. And the housing bubble, what's come to be known as the Great Recession, and an extreme resentment of those on Wall Street all led people to seek someone that they found to be more inspiring and someone to put them on a different track. So there'd been a large amount of public and private speculation, spending, and get-rich-quick schemes, which inevitably sort of lead to instability in the economy as a whole. And in 2007, we started to see this recession, and there were bank collapses in the following year in 2008, and the U.S. ended up in what is now being called the Great Recession. So it's not quite the Great Depression, but it was something notable and was not just a regular financial panic that we often see, or one of these 7-year rotations of financial downturn. In 2008, the median family income was around $50,000, but the average family owed around $84,000 in housing debt, $14,000 in school debt and auto debt, and $10,000 in home equity debt. And people were essentially just living in an upside-down model where they were unlikely to come out of it, except for with decades of payments. And by the time they got there, still not having enough money. And many of us still live in this sort of upside-down model. The college loan debt has skyrocketed. So it seems sort of likely, based on patterns, that bubble might burst itself at some point. but we'll see. And subprime mortgages were one of the biggest parts of this housing failure. And banks ended up having to sell to investors and insurance companies, and they knew that borrowers couldn't pay and would eventually be foreclosed on. So many people were kicked out of their homes after they lost their jobs, and there was a massive surplus of houses on the market. So then the prices dropped drastically, because if there are many different houses, people are not going to pay top dollar. They'll just go buy a different house. So things compounded on themselves, and the Great Recession continued for quite some time. And banks ended up essentially having worthless investments because they couldn't sell the houses to anybody. And so they stopped giving loans for houses to most people. And this caused the stock market collapse in 2008. Lehman Brothers actually suffered a $2.3 billion loss and ceased operations. And in 2008 alone, there were 2.5 million jobs lost. And this was the most in any year up until that point, since the end of World War II. And, right now, amidst the COVID crisis, this has actually changed, and we've now topped that. So we could look to some of the solutions that we turned to during this time, or solutions that we turned to in the past, but it's unknowable where this is going right now, obviously. But we have since topped that. We lost about that many jobs in, I think, a week. So in mid-2009, women outnumbered men in paying jobs outside of the home because manufacturing and construction were hit very hard, and they've been traditionally dominated by men. And they were hit hard because people weren't buying as much stuff and people weren't investing in building things, because they didn't see any potential for return during this recession. And 240,000 people were fired from Wall Street, yet executives still ended up receiving exorbitant bonuses, for essentially saying that they guided their companies and their stockholders' shares through this tough time. Bush had allowed Lehman Brothers to fail, but there was a backlash in the economy as a response to this. And there was a decision that was then made to supply $700 billion in bailouts for companies that were then deemed too big to fail. So to try to avoid economic collapse any further, they believed that this was the way to go. And part of what people were upset about was that a lot of this money ended up still going to bonuses for those who remained at these companies. So they were watching people who were part of this 1% still receive massive amounts of money, rather than it being put back into the economy directly. And about half of out-of-work people qualified for unemployment, but it does run out after a few months. And in comparison, other developed nations similar to the United States have a much more well-developed system that lasts longer and pays more. It does mean that their tax brackets are typically higher, but the taxes are typically used more efficiently, and they're not that much higher than what the United States is paying. It's just most other countries don't have the same sort of military capacity that the United States has based on that really large investment. And there were some executives that ended up having to plead guilty to conspiracy charges and fraud, but for the most part, people weren't punished for this irresponsible behavior that led to this collapse. And Bernie Madoff is an exception of this. He went to jail after developing a Ponzi scheme and cheated people out of about $50 billion. So some people did get caught, but many of the big executives of companies were not punished in any meaningful way. So in the face of all of that, there's a 2008 election, and Senator Barack Obama from Illinois ended up being elected. He was born in 1961 in Hawaii, and he ends up being one of the more surprising choices for president in American history. He was a child of an interracial marriage between a Kenyan immigrant father and a white American mother, which had been illegal in some states at the time of his birth. And he attended Columbia College and Harvard Law School, and he joined the Senate in 2004, so only 4 years before. And he gave a very rousing speech that inspired a lot of people at the DNC, the Democratic National Convention. And initially, he was fighting against Hillary Clinton for the Democratic nomination. She had political experience, she had been the First Lady, and she had served as senator in New York as well. And Obama talked about opposing the war in Iraq, which many people still did. And he talked about needing to energize the youth of the nation. And he spoke to the African American experience like nobody had up until that point. Because obviously he had lived it, and nobody else who had made it that far in presidential elections had the same sort of direct experience. So he won the Democratic nomination and went up against John McCain, who at 72 years old was the oldest to run up until that point. And in the current election cycle, there had been people down into their 30s, leading all the way up until Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump, who are all older than that, older than 72, in the 2020 election that's upcoming. And now it's down to Biden and Trump, and they're both older than this. And McCain's fatal flaw seemed to be his adoption of Sarah Palin as his VP nominee. She was widely seen as being unknowledgeable about national and international political issues, but was seen as somewhat personal and was sort of this attempt to obtain the female vote for the Republican Party. And it did not work. So he was not elected, and instead Barack Obama was. And Obama's narrative of change really resonated with people, and he was voted in as the first African American president of the United States. And more than 1 million people went to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration. And regardless of political affiliation, this was an historic event. This is the first Black president of the United States. And we'll play some of his inaugural address so you can get an idea.
Prepare to take the oath, Senator? I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear
that I will execute the office of President to the United States faithfully.
I will execute
Faithfully the office of President of
the
the
office
United
of
States.
President of the United States faithfully,
And will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States.
So help you God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President. All the best wishes.
fellow citizens, I stand here today humbled by the task before us, grateful for the trust you've bestowed, mindful of the sacrifices borne by our ancestors. I thank President Bush for his service to our nation. As well as the generosity and cooperation he has shown throughout this transition. 44 Americans have now taken the presidential oath. The words have been spoken during rising tides of prosperity and the still waters of peace. Yet, every so often, the oath is taken amidst gathering clouds and raging storms. At these moments, America has carried on not simply because of the skill or vision of those in high office, but because we, the people, have remained faithful to the ideals of our forebears and true to our founding documents. So it has been, so it must be with this generation of Americans. That we are in the midst of crisis is now well understood. Our nation is at war against a far-reaching network of violence and hatred. Our economy is badly weakened, a consequence of greed and irresponsibility on the part of some, but also our collective failure to make hard choices and prepare the nation for a new age. Homes have been lost, jobs shed, businesses shuttered. Our health care is too costly, our schools fail too many, and each day brings further evidence that the ways we use energy strengthen our adversaries and threaten our planet. These are the indicators of crisis, subject to data and statistics. Less measurable, but no less profound, is a sapping of confidence across our land. A nagging fear that America's decline is inevitable, that the next generation must lower its sights. Today, I say to you that the challenges we face are real. They are serious and they are many. They will not be met easily or in a short span of time. But know this, America, they will be met. On this day, we gather because we have chosen hope over fear, unity of purpose over conflict and discord. On this day, we come to proclaim an end to the petty grievances and false promises, the recriminations and worn-out dogmas that for far too long have strangled our politics. We remain a young nation, but in the words of Scripture, the time has come to set aside childish things. The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. In reaffirming the greatness of our nation, we understand that greatness is never a given. It must be earned. Our journey has never been one of shortcuts or settling for less. It has not been the path for the faint-hearted, for those who prefer leisure over work or seek only the pleasures of riches and fame. Rather, it has been the risk-takers, the doers, the makers of things, some celebrated, but more often men and women obscure in their labor, who have carried us up the long, rugged path towards prosperity and freedom. For us, they packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life. For us, they toiled in sweatshops and settled the West, endured the lash of the whip, and plowed the hard earth. For us, they fought and died in places like Concord and Gettysburg, Normandy, and Quezon. Time and again, these men and women struggled and sacrificed and worked till their hands were raw so that we might live a better life. They saw America as bigger than the sum of our individual ambitions, greater than all the differences of birth or wealth or faction. This is the journey we continue today. We remain the most prosperous, powerful nation on earth. Our workers are no less productive than when this crisis began. Our minds are no less inventive, our goods and services no less needed than they were last week or last month or last year. Our capacity remains undiminished. But our time of standing pat, protecting narrow interests and putting off unpleasant decisions, that time has surely passed. Starting today, we must pick ourselves up, dust ourselves off, and begin again the work of remaking America. For everywhere we look, there is work to be done. The state of our economy calls for action, bold and swift, and we will act, not only to create new jobs, but to lay a new foundation for growth. We will build the roads and bridges, the electric grids and digital lines that feed our commerce and bind us together. We will restore science to its rightful place and wield technology's wonders to raise healthcare's quality and lower its cost. We will harness the sun and the winds and the soil to fuel our cars and run our factories, and we will transform our schools and colleges and universities to meet the demands of a new age. All this we can do. All this we will do. Now, there are some who question the scale of our ambitions, who suggest that our system cannot tolerate too many big plans. Their memories are short, for they have forgotten what this country has already done, what free men and women can achieve when imagination is joined to common purpose and necessity to courage. What the cynics fail to understand is that the ground has shifted beneath them, that the stale political arguments that have consumed us for so long no longer apply. The question we ask today is not whether our government is too big or too small, but whether it works, whether it helps families find jobs at a decent wage, care they can afford, a retirement that is dignified. Where the answer is yes, we intend to move forward. Where the answer is no, programs will end. And those of us who manage the public's dollars will be held to account to spend wisely, reform bad habits, and do our business in the light of day, because only then can we restore the vital trust between a people and their government. Nor is the question before us whether the market is a force for good or ill. Its power to generate wealth and expand freedom is unmatched. But this crisis has reminded us that without a watchful eye, the market can spin out of control. The nation cannot prosper long when it favors only the prosperous. The success of our economy has always depended not just on the size of our gross domestic product, but on the reach of our prosperity, on the ability to extend opportunity to every willing heart. Not out of charity, but because it is the surest route to our common good. As for our common defense, we reject as false the choice between our safety and our ideals. Our founding fathers faced with perils that we can scarcely imagine, drafted a charter to assure the rule of law and the rights of man, a charter expanded by the blood of generations. Those ideals still light the world, and we will not give them up for expedience sake. And so, to all the other peoples and governments who are watching today, from the grandest capitals to the small village where my father was born, know that America is a friend of each nation and every man, woman, and child who seeks a future of peace and dignity, and we are ready to lead once more. understood that our power alone cannot protect us, nor does it entitle us to do as we please. Instead, they knew that our power grows through its prudent use. Our security emanates from the justness of our cause, the force of our example, the tempering qualities of humility and restraint. We are the keepers of this legacy. Guided by these principles once more, we can meet those new threats that demand even greater effort, even greater cooperation and understanding between nations. We will begin to responsibly leave Iraq to its people and forge a hard-earned peace in Afghanistan. With old friends and former foes, we will work tirelessly to lessen the nuclear threat and roll back the specter of a warming planet. We will not apologize for our way of life, nor will we waver in its defense. And for those who seek to advance their aims by inducing terror and slaughtering innocents, we say to you now that our spirit is stronger and cannot be broken. You cannot outlast us, and we will defeat you. For we know that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. We are shaped by every language and culture, drawn from every end of this earth. And because we have tasted the bitter swill of civil war and segregation and emerged from that dark chapter stronger and more united, we cannot help but believe that the old hatreds shall someday pass, that the lines of tribes shall soon dissolve, that as the world grows smaller, our common humanity shall reveal itself, and that America must play its role in ushering in a new era of peace. To the Muslim world, we seek a new way forward based on mutual interest and mutual respect. To those leaders around the globe who seek to sow conflict or blame their society's ills on the West, know that your people will judge you on what you can build, not what you destroy. To those who cling to power through corruption and deceit and the silencing of dissent, know that you are on the wrong side of history, but that we will extend a hand if you are willing to unclench your fist. To the people of poor nations, we pledge to work alongside you to make your farms flourish and let clean waters flow, to nourish starved bodies and feed hungry minds. To those nations like ours that enjoy relative plenty, we say we can no longer afford indifference to the suffering outside our borders, nor can we consume the world's resources without regard to effect. For the world has changed, and we must change with it. As we consider the road that unfolds before us, we will remember with humble gratitude those brave Americans who, at this very hour, patrol far-off deserts and distant mountains. They have something to tell us, just as the fallen heroes who lie in Arlington whisper through the ages. We honor them not only because they are the guardians of our liberty, but because they embody the spirit of service, a willingness to find meaning in something greater than themselves. And yet, at this moment, a moment that will define a generation, it is precisely this spirit that must inhabit us all. For as much as government can do and must do, it is ultimately the faith and determination of the American people upon which this nation relies. It is the kindness to take in a stranger when the levees break, the selflessness of workers who would rather cut their hours than see a friend lose their job, which sees us through our darkest hours. It is the firefighter's courage to storm a stairway filled with smoke, but also a parent's willingness to nurture a child that finally decides our fate. Our challenges may be new. The instruments with which we meet them may be new. But those values upon which our success depends, honesty and hard work, courage and fair play, tolerance and curiosity, loyalty and patriotism. These things are old. These things are true. They have been the quiet force of progress throughout our history. What is demanded then is a return to these truths. What is required of us now is a new era of responsibility, a recognition on the part of every American that we have duties to ourselves, our nation, and the world. Duties that we do not grudgingly accept, but rather seize gladly, firm in the knowledge that there is nothing so satisfying to the spirit, so defining of our character, than giving our all to a difficult task. This is the price and the promise of citizenship. This is the source of our confidence, the knowledge that God calls on us to shape an uncertain destiny. This is the meaning of our liberty and our creed, why men and women and children of every race and every faith can join in celebration across this magnificent mall. And why a man whose father less than 60 years ago might not have been served in a local restaurant can now stand before you and take a most sacred oath. So let us mark this day with remembrance of who we are and how far we have traveled. In the year of America's birth, in the coldest of months, a small band of patriots huddled by dying campfires on the shores of an icy river. The capital was abandoned. The enemy was advancing. The snow was stained with blood. The moment when the outcome of our revolution was most in doubt, the father of our nation ordered these words be read to the people. Let it be told to the future world that in the depth of winter, when nothing but hope and virtue could survive, that the city and the country, alarmed at one common danger, came forth to meet it. America, in the face of our common dangers, in this winter of our hardship, let us remember these timeless words. With hope and virtue, let us brave once more the icy currents and endure what storms may come. Let it be said by our children's children that when we were tested, we refused to let this journey end, that we did not turn back nor did we falter. And with eyes fixed on the horizon and God's grace upon us, we carried forth that great gift of freedom and delivered it safely to future generations. Thank you. God bless you. And God bless the United States of America.
So, as you can hear, much of the language that's used in this particular inauguration speech was an attempt to unite people based on what are seen as common goals throughout history. So you hear him talking about the people who perform labor as being important, and people who come from all different backgrounds as being an important part of the nation. So whether or not you liked him as a president or voted for him as a president, or regardless of any situation like that, the language being used there was an attempt to mend divides that had become quite big. And we know we're sitting in perhaps even a more dire situation than at this point in 2008, 2009, January of 2009. But we know that there are some pretty stark divisions in the country, and there have been historically. But as the first African American president, his inauguration is particularly historic. So his time in office starts out with participation in 2 wars continuing and an economy in crisis. And sort of taking a page out of the Jimmy Carter playbook, which you talked about before, Obama ended up focusing on diplomacy efforts rather than unilateral force. And he was stating to be interested in protection of the environment, combating the inequality in the financial sector of the country, and tackling healthcare, which we know there were very strong efforts that have ended in what is commonly referred to as Obamacare, but it's called the Affordable Care Act. And he was also interested in looking into the Wall Street epidemic that had led to the Great Recession, so looking into the root causes for that Great Recession. And as president, he barred the use of torture in Guantanamo and set out a plan for diplomacy with the so-called Muslim world, so the Middle East, and sought protection for abortion and reproductive rights, and denied that the U.S. should be involved in any more empire building. And Sonia Sotomayor was appointed to the Supreme Court of the United States as the first Latina person on the court. And President Obama attempted to establish governmental support for healthcare, clean energy, and public education. And we know that these are particularly fraught areas, and they continued to be. So with healthcare, this is perhaps the most notable accomplishment of the Obama presidency, the Affordable Care Act. And this was an attempt to end discrimination in healthcare insurance. You can no longer deny people who had pre-existing conditions, and you are no longer allowed to be charged more based on biological sex. So women were typically charged more for treatment and insurance than were men based on the amount of reproductive health care required. So this did have some controversial parts for it for many people, and that was that you were required to obtain health insurance. So this is instead of having a national health care initiative like many people had asked for well over a century at varying times. And you've likely heard that come up this round of presidential elections. But it was controversial for a lot of people because they would face a penalty at tax time if they couldn't have proof of having obtained insurance. And people didn't want to be forced to, some people didn't want to be forced to get it, but many people, about 16 million people, ended up getting insurance who had previously been without it, who hadn't had access to it. And we know that financially speaking, there had been racial disparities throughout the U.S. historically, and African Americans continued to suffer more heavily than white Americans under the Great Recession. And a lot of this had to do with the wealth that African Americans had obtained largely was tied up in homes. And with foreclosures running rampant throughout the country, there was a sharp decline in wealth for African Americans as a whole. In 2012, the median family income for white Americans was $110,000, while it was $6,300 for African Americans. So the median is not the average. Median means that it falls. If you lined up everyone's income in a line, it would be the middle number. So this is to say that there are more people living well below the poverty line for African Americans than there are for white Americans. And this is not to say that the average income for a white family is $110,000 or the average American income for an African American family is $6,300. Again, if you lined up all of the incomes in a row and did the middle number, that's this. The Voting Rights Act, which had been passed in 1965, was amended at this point to allow states to change election laws. And unfortunately, this led to many of the ID issues that oftentimes boil down to racial disparity in access to voting. So African Americans, Latino Americans, and Native Americans have all been groups that were more directly affected by these ID requirements. And sometimes this has to do with the address, or for Native Americans specifically, this continues to be an issue because reservation addresses work differently than those within what is technically the United States, in a way that a reservation system is somewhat separate. And this continues to be an issue. Many people from racial minorities in the United States don't have easy access to their birth records, and that makes it hard to obtain an ID sometimes. The Black Lives Matter movement spread throughout the nation in response to a string of killings of young black men, mostly by mostly white police officers, and requesting that there be further police training and accountability when excessive force had been used. So most of the time, the officers who had used their weapons were not sentenced. And it wasn't all police officers either. Trayvon Martin in 2012 was a young black teenager who was killed by George Zimmerman, who was later acquitted. But he was part of his neighborhood watch. He wasn't a police officer. And Eric Garner was killed in 2014 when he was held in an illegal chokehold by a police officer after selling cigarettes on the streets, and there were no charges in this case as well. Freddie Gray in Baltimore had a small knife, which was legal, and died in police custody in a van. And perhaps most famously, because of what followed, Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri, and he was unarmed at the time, and the officer was later cleared. And there were weeks of sometimes violent street demonstrations that followed, and the state police and the National Guard ended up being called in to the city from Ferguson, and they were wearing essentially battle gear and carrying assault rifles, which shows the increased militarization of the police force across the nation as well. And the city was later investigated and found to have indeed exhibited a pattern of discrimination and targeting of African American community for revenue stream. So this was not solely in response to this one murder. This was just the tipping point. And this sort of thing compounded on itself and continued to pop up in the news seemingly daily across the nation. And the Black Lives Matter movement was out there giving a voice to these injustices and asking for change and asking for people to join them in thinking about how things could and needed to change. In a similar sense of frustration, there was the Occupy Wall Street movement in 2011 that began with a few dozen people camping in the New York City financial district. They were mostly protesting Wall Street behavior that led to the Great Recession. And eventually there were hundreds camped out there and thousands across the nation that camped out in their states' capitals and large cities. And this is where we most recently have the rhetoric of the 99% and versus the 1%. And there were strikes across the nation that were demanding $15 minimum wage in many cities. In 2015, New York State actually adopted the minimum wage, following the localities of Seattle and Los Angeles in 2014. So some places did make changes based on these protests. And more than 1/5 of American children were living in poverty in 2015. And that's the highest figure in the industrialized world for a country that has a massive amount of money. And with all these issues raging on the home front, Obama went out into the larger world and attempted to change some things, as he had said he would. In 2011, many soldiers came home from Iraq. 5,000 soldiers had died there, and hundreds of thousands of Iraqi soldiers and civilians died as well over the 8 years of warfare. There are still advisors in Iraq, and it does not mean that they're not facing combat. It's just not the same level of declared war. And there's $2 trillion spent on the war effort over there. And while most people wanted the Afghanistan war to end, the troop presence was actually increased due to the rising threat, specifically eventually from ISIS. And in May of 2011, there was an armed raid that ended in the killing of Osama bin Laden and others who were in the Pakistan compound where he'd been hiding. 2011 also saw a Libyan NATO campaign which overthrew Gaddafi, which ended up leading to a civil war in Libya. And in 2014, the U.S. saw the normalization of diplomatic relations with Cuba. And this had been the first time since the Cold War that the U.S. and Cuba had a diplomatic relationship. In 2016, Obama signed on to the Paris Climate Agreement, which meant to limit carbon emissions across the globe. This was recently overturned by the current president, and it didn't obviously last for very long. 2016 is not very long ago. And throughout the Middle East, there was what is now called the Arab Spring, in which millions of people took to the streets to demand an end to dictatorships, including Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya. And there were mixed results and mixed consequences. Some of what happened here is this led to a power vacuum, and ISIS was eventually added into the American vernacular in addition to the Taliban and Al-Qaeda, and they took control over many localities and led a brutal campaign of beheadings and used similarly gruesome tactics against religious minorities and Westerners in the Middle East. And the U.S. continues to be involved heavily in the Middle East and in the battles that take place there. In the 2012 election, Mitt Romney was the first Mormon to be nominated by a major political party for president. He'd previously been the governor of Massachusetts and worked for Bain Capital, and he chose Paul Ryan as a running mate. And this made it the first time that the Republican Party ticket did not have a Protestant on the ticket at all. And Obama ended up winning this election with 332 electoral votes. And 51% versus 47% of the popular vote. And in 2012, Tulsi Gabbard became the first Hindu in the House of Representatives, and Mazie Hirono became the first Buddhist in the Senate. So there were a lot of religious firsts that happened in this particular election. And there was about $6 billion that was spent for presidential and congressional races in 2012. And part of this massive amount of money being able to be spent was the 2010 decision of Citizens United versus the Federal Elections Commission. And this decided that federal restrictions on political contributions were overturned, essentially, and people were allowed to make these PACs, these political action committees, which were allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money so long as they weren't directly connected to a campaign. So this idea of freedom that we've been talking about, this idea of liberty that we've been talking about this whole semester, morphs yet again over the 21st century. So from 1900 to 2000, this is the 20th century, there was incredible expansion of rights as well as incredible tragedy. The decolonization of Africa and Asia were quite an expansion of rights and self-governance. Women gained citizenship across the globe, and unfortunately in many places this is still lacking, but it was expanded quite greatly during the 20th century and continuing to do so in the 21st. Science, technology, and medicine led us to lead longer lives and have the ability to actually leave the planet and return, which is enormously mind-blowing, I think, for me at least, that we can leave, visit the moon, and come back. The scientific reality of going to Mars seems to be building as well. And day-to-day life improved more drastically during the 20th century than it had in any other century. There, on the other side of this, continued to be massive wars, entire global conflicts, genocide, degradation of the environment as a result of some of these expansions, and technological benefits. And those continue to be this sort of underbelly of progress. So it's important to consider both sides when thinking about all of these different pieces. With the US in particular, in 1900, the typical home had no indoor plumbing, no phone, no car, and no one who graduated from high school. And by 1940s, there was still a full third of homes that had no running water. By 2013, the lifespan for men and women had risen to 76 and 81, respectively. And that was up from, in 1900, 46 and 48 as the expected lifespan. Some of that has to do with infant mortality as well, that would potentially skew the numbers here. But there was a great increase in life expectancy for people. And poverty and income inequality and infant mortality still remain higher in the United States than in other industrialized nations. And that's still a problem that sociologists, anthropologists, and historians look at, as well as economists. And there are more people who are affiliated with religions in the United States than any other nations of similar culture. So there are about 60% in the United States who are affiliated with some religion, about 32%, so about half that in Great Britain, 25% in Italy, and 11% in France. So most other nations that we would say that we're quite similar to have a much lower instance of affiliation with a religion and have become much more secularized. And the U.S. still far outweighs any other country in murders committed by gun and gun suicides, and mass shootings have played a major role in the lives of teenagers in the 20th century, the 21st century so far. This is sort of something that started to tick up at the end of the 20th century and continues to be continues to be a problem that we face on a very large scale, to the point where there are regularly trainings in all levels of schooling about how to deal with a potential shooting situation. So currently, as we stand right now, the Electoral College, for the 5th time in history, elected the candidate who lost a popular vote in 2016 with the contest between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. There continue to be discussions about race and immigration, as there always have been, and sometimes they become more intense than others. And now is one of the times where things sort of seem to be going to a boiling point. And there's continued wealth inequality and discussions about that, as there often have been throughout U.S. history and throughout organized human history in general. Partisanship is particularly high at this point, and we'll remind you that it certainly has been in the past, to the point where we even had a civil war. So this is certainly not the worst that it's been, but it is not. It is coming to more of a fever pitch than it has at other points. So this is definitely one of the more contentious times. And what we can take away from studying all of this and looking at all of this over a span, as we have this semester, we can see that history isn't necessarily a constant uptick. That's not what we mean by progress as we move through history. There are times when we make a massive expansion of rights to more people, and then there are times when those things are reversed and then it goes back. But generally, you can see throughout these waves that things still continue to improve for people. There are hard times in between and times where things dip quite low. But it is unusual, for example, now to experience some of the same things that you would think of in 1900. So, for example, lynchings are not common. Telling women they can't vote is not common. There are things that we have moved past, but there are new things that we still must deal with. And if we study history and we study what we've tried before and we've studied what has been successful and what has failed, then we'll have a better idea of how to move forward. Again, this is a particularly contentious time right now, and sort of an uncertain time with COVID-19 sort of redefining how we operate as a nation, and a presidential election coming up later this year. So we will likely see 2020 as one of these notable years, like we've mentioned throughout. So if we can remember that people have lived through these sorts of experiences, and that we could come together and find some common ground. This has been done before. It is possible, and we can attempt to move forward in a way that's more constructive for the greater number of people. So we'll see what happens, and I appreciate you all coming on this journey. I'm sorry that our classes became changed at the end of this and that we weren't allowed to continue having discussions as we had been, and meeting in person. But I do hope that we've all had time to consider what what this history means to us, and how we can use it to construct our lives and construct our understanding of other people's lives. So with that, that is the end of the official semester, and thank you for taking this class. I would like to end with a Langston Hughes poem called Refugee in America. It says, "There are words like freedom, sweet and wonderful to say. On my heartstrings freedom sings, all day, every day. There are words like liberty that almost make me cry. If you had known what I know, you would know why."